The Pirate Software 16th Game Jam was a challenge to make an entire game in 2 weeks based on the theme You Are the Weapon. I had a road trip planned for the last 2 days of the jam, so my goal was to enter and submit my game 2 or 3 days before the deadline so I could relax and have a stress-free holiday. As you can see, that didn't happen. I made the submission by the skin of my teeth. Truth is, you never know what kind of obstacles will arise during game development, and as you'll soon find out, it's a miracle I made the submission deadline at all. For the submission, I needed to upload a version of my game that runs in browser to itch.io, and I also needed a game design document. A game design document, or a GDD, is a breakdown of your game that includes things like story, characters, technical requirements, gameplay, mechanics, visual style, future additions, etc. Think of it like a document that someone else could use to finish developing your game if you suddenly stopped working on it. Unfortunately, I fell back on a nasty college habit and decided to save the GDD for last so that I could jump straight into the fun part, making the game. On the first day of the game jam, the theme was announced as You Are the Weapon, and I needed a game idea. The first idea that came to mind was a game about a sentient sword who wanted to escape a dungeon. You would want to improve your stats like sharpness, so one of the NPCs exploring the dungeon would be enticed to pick you up and bring you with them. But in other game jams I've seen, the games that rose to the top were always smart or out-of-the-box takes on the theme. I knew most of the other people in the jam would do this sentient sword or weapon idea because it's the first thing that comes to mind, so I wanted to do something different. As long as it didn't take too long to come up with an idea, I would be fine. So, it was day 3 and I was struggling to come up with an idea. At this point, I was thinking I would like to do something with cards because I had recently done a card game tutorial series on my channel, so I could develop a card game way quicker as everything was fresh in my head. I didn't have an idea yet, but I was thinking that battling with the mind was a clever take on the theme. An idea was forming in my own mind about a lawyer representing a big gaming company like Nintendo suing a child for copyright infringement or something silly like that. I had the idea that the lawyer enters the courtroom, opens his briefcase, and has sticky notes plastered on the inside of it, which are the actions you can take to win the court battle and annihilate the child. Which sticky notes you choose to use could influence the jury and judge's opinion of you and get you closer or further from a victory. I forgot to mention earlier that teams of up to 5 people were allowed in the game jam, and I had partnered up with my partner, who was going to do the art for the game. When I told her my idea, she liked it, but as I explained my idea further, she found out that I had no clue how court cases actually work. She also pointed out how we are kind of pitting ourselves against Ace Attorney, which is an iconic, very fun and charming game about being a lawyer, so we would probably be in its shadow or at least compared to it, which we both wanted to avoid. It was now day 4, and after some more conversation, we had the idea of changing the setting from a lawyer in court to a streamer during an online debate. A lot of the ideas carried over very well, such as the sticky notes could be on the streamer's monitor instead of inside the lawyer's briefcase, and we also had the idea to replicate the chat from streaming platforms like Twitch, where messages would come in and reflect the state of the game, with people cheering you on when you're winning and threatening to unsub when you're losing. We both loved this new setting, so we had our idea. We were driving home from a party we attended the night before and decided to stop to get a marker and some sticky notes so my partner could crank out some art on the 2-hour drive home. One of the things I don't see talked about so much in game jams is simply finding the time. I quit my job to make games for a while, so I was fine, but my partner has a full-time job, and finding the time and energy to do more work after working 9 hours a day, 5 days a week is not easy. Taking advantage of this 2-hour drive where she couldn't do anything else was huge. Every single sticky note used in the game was drawn on this drive, and even a few more that didn't make it into the final game. Sorry, fence sitting. When we got home, I opened Godot, which was the game engine I was going to use to make the game. I created the project and did some basic setup, but I was wrecked at this point, so that was the end of day 4. I started day 5 by implementing some things from my card tutorial series, such as dragging cards around the screen, instantiating cards, and adding a player hand. I also started working on the chat functionality, since it was quite a unique thing to this game, and I wanted to make sure I had it working early in development. I made a rich text label and enabled this BB code option so that I could use tags. You can surround text with these tags to affect the text, like changing its color, making it bold, or centering it. Then I put in a few sample chats as a placeholder with an empty line in between each chat to give them some space. Then, when a new chat comes in, I wanted to remove the oldest chat and add the newest one to the bottom, the same way it works on Twitch and other streaming platforms. I used the remove paragraph function built into Godot and pass in 0 because I want to remove the top paragraph, which is the oldest chat, and then I used this exact same line a second time to get rid of that empty line before the next chat. Then to add my new chat, I just used the append text function and I pass in 2 paragraph tags, one to move the text onto a new line, and the other to move it onto a new line again, to leave that empty line of space from the previous chat above. And then I just add my chat, which I hard-coded to the string new chat, just for now. I can improve this later to pull a random message from a database instead. Then I added a timer that adds a new chat and restarts when it reaches 0, so that a new chat is added every second. And that was the end of day 5. On day 6, I decided to implement dialogue early as well, because a couple of years ago, I tried to implement a dialogue system by following a tutorial, and it was really complex. It used interfaces, and it had a dialogue manager, as well as a dialogue sender or something, and there was like 5 different scripts doing different things. I was sure now that I actually understood code that I could just make a single simple dialogue script, without all that over-engineered stuff from the tutorial. I wanted the dialogue to appear one character at a time until the message was complete, like it's typing out. Then the user would have to press enter to go to the next line. Since I knew I didn't have much time, I looked up a Godot dialogue tutorial in case I went down a rabbit hole of doing the wrong thing, which I would never do, by the way. And in the popular tutorial I saw, they set a timer with a really short wait time, and when that timer reaches 0, they add the next character of their message to the text of the rich text label. Then they check if the amount of characters currently in the text is same as the amount of characters in the full message to show, and if it is, the message has finished typing, and if not, they just start the timer again. I knew this wouldn't work for me since I wanted to use BB code tags in my messages. If I followed this tutorial, the message would type out one character at a time, including the tags, until the closing bracket of the tag types out, and only then Godot would realize it was a tag and apply its effect instead of just showing it in the text. When I created the rich text label for my dialogue, I noticed that there was a property called visible characters. You can increase this property to display the next character, and the message is already loaded in, it just hides the rest of the characters. So Godot knows where the tags are and doesn't count the tag characters as characters to display. Then there's also a visible ratio property that changes depending on how much of the text is visible, and I could use that to know when the message was finished typing out, because this value would be 1. So in my dialogue script, I take in the message to display, and I set the rich text label's text property to that message. Then I set visible characters equals 0 to hide the message, and then I start the chat timer with a really short wait time, and when it reaches 0, I check if visible ratio is equal to 1, and if it is, that means the message is finished typing out, and I can wait for the user to press enter to load the next message, but if it's not, I increase visible characters by 1 and start the timer again. It's a really simple, nice dialogue script, and I will definitely be making a tutorial video dedicated to it soon. That was definitely it for day 6. On day 7, I added some dialogue for when the game starts to showcase the player's internal thoughts. I wrote a joke in here where the player's voice cracks when he greets the opponent, but I wanted a little bit of polish on the text to really sell the voice crack. I decided I want to use Superscript on the E of the hey. Superscript is when the letter appears a bit smaller and higher, like when you see a power such as 2 to the power of 2, how that second 2 is up high and a little smaller. But Godot doesn't have a BB code tag for Superscript or Subscript. I considered using a second text box to place the E higher than the rest of the text, but I would have to time it with the typing out of the characters before and after the E, which would be a nightmare. I knew that any other solution would take too long, and that I should just cut the joke. So naturally, I did the only logical thing. I spent the entire rest of the day figuring out how to override Godot's process custom fx function and forcefully coded my own Superscript tag into the engine. This made me feel like a coding god, but the game jam was now half over, and I needed to concentrate on getting all the technical requirements finished instead of getting distracted by polish like this. I still needed to implement some essentials like menus, sounds, and the actual sticky note abilities. If only there was some sort of document I could refer back to with the minimum requirements, I might not have gotten distracted by this kind of polish. Even though I'd lost a few days of development coming up with an idea and spent most of day 7 trying to make my joke land, I was on track for finishing this game a day or two early. Implementing abilities for the sticky notes would be quick because I had done it recently for my card tutorial series, and doing the menus and sounds are all things I've done before for college projects. The most time-consuming thing I had left to do was to add the dialogue for the opponent's responses when you play a note. I had a lot of momentum built up, and I was very happy with the development so far. It felt like there was nothing that could stop me now. Met Éireann has issued a nationwide red weather warning for Storm Éowyn. According to ESB, more than 700,000 homes and businesses lost power. Met Éireann reported a gust of 184 kilometers an hour in County Galway, which beat the previous record of 182 kilometers an hour in County Limerick in 1945. The government has said this is potentially the worst storm to ever hit Ireland.
Well, this sucks.
As you can tell, my electricity is gone, so there's definitely nothing I can do tonight, which is unfortunate, but I am really hoping that it comes back tomorrow, because I still have a lot of game left to make. My electricity came back on day 10 and I was starting to panic. I had missed another day of development and I wasn't sure if my electricity would hold out or if it would go again. I also realised I still had to test my game and make sure it worked when exported to web, which is not something I have done before. So I really needed to knuckle down if I was going to get this finished before my trip. I only really had 4 days of development left and still had a lot of game to make. I implemented a pause menu with a settings menu and a restart button. I added a volume slider for music and one for sound effects. I also added a windscreen and a lose screen to use for later. I then implemented sounds. I made my own sounds for the sticky notes and I found a heartbeat sound online for the start of the game to convey the player character's panic. I also found the battle music online. I found both of them on freesound.org and made sure to check the licenses to make sure they were okay to use in the game. I connected those sounds up to the volume sliders in the settings menu so the user had control over the volume. I also created a chat's database and added arrays of usernames, messages for if you're starting the game, winning and losing, and then instead of hard coding new chat for the chat messages, I get a random username and a random message from the database and use that instead. I also coded it so that the username who sent the last chat won't be chosen twice in a row, and same for the message, so you won't see the same message or username right next to each other in the chat. I also randomized the chat timer's wait time for each message to be between 0.3 and 1.1 seconds to make the chat feel more natural and unpredictable. And that was me for day 10. I was quite aware at this point of how much game there was left to make. I definitely needed to crank out some abilities the next day. On day 11, I scanned in all of the sticky notes that my girlfriend had drawn. When I tried to make the background of the sticky note transparent and put it in the game, it didn't look right because it was very hard to separate the edges of the note from the white of the scanned background. So I found a sticky note asset on Adobe Stock, making sure it was not AI generated since that was one of the rules of the game jam, and Adobe Stock is filled with 90% AI generated slop. I then used Photoshop to select just the black marker on each sticky note and pasted it onto the stock sticky note image. This looked way better and really fit the style of the game we were going for. I then set it up so that when a note is instantiated, it uses the correct note image from the assets folder. I also implemented the base card ability script, and in here I added a card played function that would have the code for the note's ability. I also added a get ability text function that is called when you hover over a note to show that note's ability. I implemented the card flip animation from my tutorial series and used it when you hover over a note so that you reveal its ability text on the back of the note. I then duplicated the card ability script 34 times since there are going to be 35 notes in the game, and I renamed each ability script according to its note name, like Evidence and Gaslight. It was then the end of day 11, and although I hadn't implemented the abilities yet, I still had got a lot done. On day 12, I implemented the abilities for all 35 notes. Some notes just dealt damage, while others might apply confusion to the opponent, deal double damage if the opponent is confused, heal the player, etc. I also added yields to the ability so that playing notes would yield certain notes next turn. For example, playing fact would mean evidence gets added to your hand next turn. If you're playing the game yourself and think the abilities could be more in-depth or balanced, just remember that every single ability was thought out and implemented in one day. I did what I could. I also scrapped the dragging around notes functionality, and instead, you now click on a note to activate its ability. And that was the end of day 12. At this point, my mind was getting fried, and although I love game development, I was very much looking forward to being on holiday and not looking at a screen. Day 13 was the final day of development before my road trip beginning early the next day, and I still had quite a lot to do. I firstly applied the rest of the art that my girlfriend made for the game. She drew a background before the opponent connects and one for when he connects. I then was able to position the chat rich text label correctly on the monitor and watched messages flow through, perfectly displayed in all their glory. She had also drawn up the opponent character and 15 different facial expressions for him. Also, can I just say, thank God she wanted to work with me on this, because otherwise the visuals would have looked a little less like this and a little more like this. I implemented a dialogue database, and in here I store all the dialogue for the opponent responses to each note. I also point to which opponent facial expression image to use if I want to change it, and I updated the dialogue script to support this. I spent the rest of the day writing opponent dialogue into this new dialogue database. It was now day 13 and the game was still not finished. I had not tested the abilities at all yet and still needed to make the whole GDD. I put the project files on my laptop and brought it on my trip so that I could hopefully finish the game when we got to our first stop. We were staying the night in a hotel, and when we got there, I started testing the game, making sure to use all 35 notes to make sure their abilities worked correctly. I had to cut a couple of the abilities here that were either broken or would take too long to fix or balance, and just change their ability to simply deal damage instead. And I fixed a bunch of bugs. While I was doing that, my girlfriend created the GDD. After all that, it was then nighttime and my girlfriend was asleep. I exported the game as a HTML file, which I've never done before, and basically just prayed that it worked. I then uploaded it to itch, and the bottom of the game where the cards were was chopped off. And the heartbeat sound that works in the editor when you start the game just doesn't work here. It makes a funny noise when the game loads and then just doesn't play. This was not as big of a problem though. I was brainstorming how to fix the screen chopped off issue, but I was wrecked at this point. I tried a bunch of settings on itch which didn't help, so I thought maybe I could just shift the whole game up so it cuts the top off instead of the bottom, since you at least needed to see the cards and their abilities to be able to play. But any solution I thought of sounded like too much work, and I was wrecked. So I just went to bed, knowing that the submission was tomorrow at 1 PM, so I had a little bit of time. It was the morning of day 14, and the submission was in a few hours. I did not want to spend another day of the holiday working, so if I couldn't figure this out now, I was going to submit it as it was. I hoped I would find something in Godot's project settings that could maybe force the screen into the right size. The first thing I tried was to change stretch mode to canvas items, since it sounded like the only setting in the window settings that might do anything. I exported it, tested it, and lo and behold, it worked. Gotta love those fresh morning eyes. I didn't care to fix the sound problem or do any more testing. I just submitted everything there and then with 4 hours until the deadline. There is a few things that I had written down or started working on but didn't have time to implement. These included the couple of card abilities that were cut, screen shake when you take damage, a health bar instead of just having text, items that were going to be on the desk like coffee that was going to make you caffeinated so your next attack would deal double damage, sound effects for things like dialogue typing out, the opponent joining the call, or when you or the opponent are damaged. I also had a combo in my mind for the card guilt that would deal damage to your opponent for every time you've apologized, and then if you drank the coffee and played it, you could wipe out the opponent with massive damage. These kind of things would have added more depth and strategy to the gameplay. I got some good feedback from people who played the game. They loved the idea and especially the chat, but they also informed me that the game crashes if you win, and the restart button doesn't work correctly, so if you lose and want to play again, you'll have to refresh the page. People also expected to be able to click to progress the dialogue, and had to press random buttons until they found out they were supposed to press enter. It was unfortunate that there was a couple of bugs, but at least the game works basically perfectly until the end. Above all, I was elated to have the game submitted and mostly working. I went for breakfast and felt the stress just wash away from me. I had felt like our game was a really good idea, and I didn't want to let it down by submitting anything less than my best. This submission felt like it really mattered to me. It was my first game jam, and possibly my last. It was also the first game I have ever published, and since it was tied to me, or at least tied to Barry's development hell, I wanted it to be a reflection of my abilities. I wanted it to be good and fun to play, even if it was just made in 2 weeks. And so for those reasons, I was quite stressed near the end. Probably more stressed than I have been for any exam in my life. I think if the storm hadn't happened, I wouldn't have been nearly as stressed, as it did set me back. But I think in game development and in life, there is always going to be a storm. Maybe not an actual physical storm, but some sort of obstacle that comes across your path and destroys all of your plans and your momentum. But even the strongest storm will pass, and when it does, the scene is set for us to have a comeback even greater than our setback. We spent the rest of day 14 driving around the Ring of Kerry, having the absolute best time of our lives, enjoying the calm after the storm. I want to say a big thank you to my girlfriend for working with me on this project and for not minding me working on the first day of our holiday. Her Blue Sky and Instagram links are in the description. She posts about the upcoming card game we've been working on together, so if you have a moment, go over and show her some love. And if you want to play the game yourself, the itch.io link is also in the description. I also want to say thank you to those supporting me on Patreon. You guys are the only thing between me and a full-time job right now, and this game would have been so exponentially worse if I had also been working full-time. As a thanks, after this video goes out, I'm going to upload all the Lord of Debate project files to Patreon, so you can download it, play it, change it, flame the rushed code, see how I implemented certain things, or whatever you want. I'll leave the audio files out, just because I'm pretty sure I can't distribute the music files, only use them in games, but everything else will be left as is. If you want to support me or get access to the files, my Patreon will be linked in the description as well. And that's it for this video. Thank you so much for watching. Please consider leaving a like if you enjoyed, and subscribing for more game dev content.